Open source software. You heard of it, usually it means free. Yes, on the surface level, open source means that you can get not only executable files, but also source files to modify and build a version of your own. Some things are open, some things are closed, you might not care about it as long as it works. But I'm here to argue that open versus closed software debate is actually very important. Welcome to the complete guide of free and open source versus proprietary. Source code and binary. Without jumping too much into technicalities, let me explain the fundamental difference between source code and binary code. Think about this like a recipe and a dish. Binary executable files are something that your computer runs directly, ones and zeros. Binary is easy to execute by your computer, but almost impossible to read and understand. It's your overly processed dish, you don't know what goes on inside there. Source code is your recipe, it contains all of the information about the dish. Having a source code, you can make your own version of binary, and you know exactly what's inside too. The dawn of software. Back in the day, free and open source software was just called software. Most software at the time was shared with a source code, but after Copyright Act of 1976, source code was protected as intellectual property. So more and more software development companies started licensing only the binary programs and limiting access to the source code. Richard Stallman, a student at MIT, raised in the hacker culture of 70s. Hacking in 70s was more about using a computer in an unintended way, called denying access to the source code a crime against humanity, and wrote a GNU General Public License, thus creating a free software movement. GPL is basically a public domain. Everyone is able to see, modify and use the source code for anything, but with one caveat: your modified version can only be distributed with the same free GPL license. Otherwise, it would be really easy to just get a GPL program for free, change something a little, call it your own proprietary application, and close the access to the source code. Both software paradigms have a huge impact not just on computing, but on everyone. Let's break it down. But first, everybody's favorite, definitions. Free software. Free as in freedom or liberty. Software that you are free to use in any way you want, free to modify and free to share. Open source. Source code is available to modify and edit. Source code available software. Developer might provide the source code, but ownership is still 100% with the original developer. Proprietary software, developed and licensed by a single entity, fully in control by that entity as an intellectual property. FOSS, free and open source, term created to clear any confusion between free software and proprietary software that is distributed free of charge. Usually development of proprietary program starts by a software company with market researchers and team of developers. Developers have to write even the most basic tools from scratch, as copying from other programs is not possible because of licensing, making development process costly, and distribution platforms like operating system list short. A lot of open source projects are started by a single person with some extra free time on their hands to solve some kind of problem for themselves. Keeping FOSS license allows a developer to use any other FOSS code, making the development process a lot easier. You can just copy someone else's code, and that's okay, because making something from scratch over and over again is stupid. Also, releasing the code publicly, other people can step in and help with development, as they might also have the same problem, thus creating a community of developers around the same project. Therefore, updates are made often, and program might be adapted for all sorts of hardware and operating systems as platforms. Money. Proprietary software from the very beginning is created for profit. Its creation is expensive, and as its code maintained by a single group of people, bug fixes, updates for new hardware are also expensive. So usually, users have to pay for software licensing in some way. For the longest time, the most popular way of getting software was one-time payment that would get you a copy of the software and sometimes free updates too. But as the program becomes popular enough that everyone who is able to buy it have bought it, the stream of revenue stops. So not that long ago, a trend of monetizing with subscriptions appeared. For example, Photoshop 2012 version was a one-time payment of $100, and now it's $20 a month. Seems like a good deal if you plan to use it for a month or two. A good publicity for Adobe. It is now cheaper to get started, but for the whole year you end up paying $240 just for Photoshop. And honestly, unless you're a very pro user, 2020 version didn't change much from the 2012 version. Great for Adobe, but not for their users. More and more professional software developers are switching to the subscription-based models. Autodesk now charges $1,500 a year for a single 3ds Max subscription. But not all proprietary software is paid. A lot of it is actually free of charge, an upfront charge, because users end up paying for it somehow. A lot of times free is used as a marketing strategy to upsell users on extra features. Or even, that's right, another subscription service. Or just your regular $2,000 to complete a game you already paid for. How free software makes money is kind of controversial topic. Intuitively, we don't want to trust free products. FOSS Codebase has to be available publicly, so straight up selling a copy is not really an option. Instead, most FOSS projects rely on donations. Donations don't sound that promising, but keep in mind that for a small open source project, support cost is close to zero. New updates and technical support will be provided by the community itself. Big projects, however, are more than capable of generating money. Good example of FOSS project getting big is the Linux kernel. It is used in desktop operating systems. In most servers, so by watching this online you are running a lot of Linux servers. And also on basically the most popular OS in the world, Android. Oh, and every supercomputer in the world uses Linux. So not a big deal. Why is it so popular over any single company making a proprietary kernel? Obviously, free to use with no fees or restrictions is a huge plus for hosting providers. Having freedom to modify will ensure that kernel on your, let's say, supercomputer designed to compute scientific data will support new 1000-core processor. It's not that easy to convince a single development company to make a special little feature just for you, but you can make one yourself. Now that Linux kernel is popular, a lot of tech giants donate huge amounts of money to keep project going. But even before that, Linux users were submitting and fixing code and donating to the project. Licensing. EULA and User License Agreement. You agreed to some in your life. Have you actually read any? If you did, you might know they don't mean anything, even according to the legal experts. It's here to protect the company, and the company reserves the right to change terms after the fact. Very Darth Vader-like. But even if you agree with the license, it still creates a bunch of problems for end users. Sometimes you have to pay more depending on how much money you make. A lot of times you pay only for a single installation, so if you have multiple computers, you have to pay more. Windows license might even break if you change some of your computer's components, and license checking is a whole different user-restricting hassle. On a FOSS site, everything is much simpler. There is no EULA. With FOSS, you get to own your software unrestricted, with no strings attached forever. Forever, because in order to change FOSS project's license, legally, every contributor whose code is used has to agree to the change. And in case of having hundreds of independent contributors, it's not really possible. Everything without processor and OS is basically a last century tech. And technology shapes everything around us, so let's break down some of the large-scale consequences of proprietary software. Privacy and freedom. So proprietary software developers have a strong incentive of the capital, and coincidentally, a legal protection for the software source code, effectively selling a black box. You do what you do with your iPhone, for example. You have no idea what goes on inside because you're legally not allowed, and because it's impossible to understand the binary code, and you get an output. It's incredibly easy then to just pack whatever into that black box. You would have to do a lot of reverse engineering and network analysis to find out what proprietary software on your device spies on you. But general rule of thumb, all of them do. Free software, on the other hand, is 100% transparent. Also, FOSS community cares a lot about privacy, so if source code contains any malware or spyware, it gets removed. Monopoly. Proprietary software developers have every incentive to make their software work with their other products, and don't work with other software by establishing their own formats, thus creating a monopoly. Open code means open formats, support for which everyone can implement in other programs. Ecosystems. Monopoly means that users don't really have a choice, so it's easy to push users to other products from the same company. Sounds good at first, a single company does it all, but it's really hard to leave a proprietary ecosystem. For example, if you're an Apple user, you might have an Apple phone, an Apple computer or multiple computers, Apple TV, and even Apple credit card. Every single thing on that list has hundreds of proprietary programs you might have bought from the Apple Store, and maybe you made in-app purchases in some programs or paid off subscriptions. Now, leaving that system wouldn't be as easy as buying a new phone and computer. You would have to give up everything you invested your time and money into. So a lot of users just don't. It's too big of a hassle to try something else, even if staying in that ecosystem gets more and more expensive. And that's only one example. Microsoft does the same with its Windows OS and Office. Adobe established an ecosystem for creative services, and Autodesk makes their users pay $1,500 for a single 3D program license annually with its own industry monopoly and ecosystem. Once again, freedom in the hands of users, so creating a restricting ecosystem is not really possible. Usually, if you need to change the hardware, you can use any manufacturer you would like. Also, open standardized file formats mostly exist thanks to free software community and FOSS licensing. Piracy. Obviously, tech companies hate it and see it as a huge business loss, but phenomenon is more complicated than stealing we often compare it to. Software development companies try to protect unauthorized copying with so-called DRM, Digital Rights Management System, a subsystem that controls access to the software, designed to prevent users from violating a licensing agreement. In theory. In reality though, DRM system can be hacked. It just always happens, so it does not really serve its purpose. Instead, it creates a whole new set of problems for users. For example, some software just won't run without internet connection to check the license, or won't output the movie to more than one monitor or speaker. Some DRM systems only allow you to run programs on a limited set of hardware, even though it might be compatible with some other hardware as well. And the whole software piracy fighting phenomenon disproportionately hits the poor. In places like Egypt, Ukraine, China, India, and a bunch of African countries, paying for a Windows $100 license is considered ridiculous. Most people just download a hacked pirated version, and that goes for everything: word processing, professional software, etc. It works, but once again, as software is just a binary, unofficial distributors can add any malware or adware to it, creating a country-wide security vulnerability. Once again, no DRM, no piracy means fast updates and superb security. Codebase stagnation. Everyone seems to agree that Windows sucks. It's slow, you have to reboot all the time, security is not that great, and updates are annoying, but it is still the most popular desktop operating system. The reason why Windows sucks is the same reason why it's popular. You see, every closed source software sooner or later will be abandoned. Developer will move to other projects, business files, all of them do eventually. So most projects are no longer receiving updates. Not a problem, right? New OS version should just support old programs, like Windows does. While to support old software, you basically need to keep all of the older operating system's parts in the new version, along with a bunch of old irrelevant now solutions, security holes, and code that is only needed to support older software. Not only does this piles all of the memory and CPU power in the operating system, it is now harder to navigate the code to fix anything at all, and it's been happening version after version. At some point, it would be a lot better to just make a new version from scratch, but next to no one will use it, as it will not support older software, and only some of those developers are still around to make a new version. And this is what's going to happen with every proprietary software sooner or later. It is destined for stagnation and painful for every user switch to a new version, making every proprietary ecosystem unsustainable. Bugs, patches, updates, new technologies all exist in the FOSS world, but building a version for a new OS does not require original developer, so this stagnation is not really a problem. So what happens if the whole world starts to use only proprietary software? Well, you might know already, a tech dystopia. First of all, proprietary creates this clear elitist separation of development companies and users. Monopolistic nature of software products makes it so only big tech survives, leaving all the control over privacy, big data to a handful of companies. Closed source also creates an education problem, both in the way users interact with a closed system and in actual universities, creating creating a world where users have to interact with black boxes renders technology as sort of modern magic. You can even see superstition patterns appearing among professions that rely on some closed data, like YouTubers for example. All of this influences the way we think about technology, shapes our society around wrong understanding about what technology can and cannot do. All modern tech problems we face every day are coming down to source code not being free to see, share and modify. Wow, this video took a while to make, apparently. It's been harder to write than animate somehow, but yeah, obviously open source and free software is something that I'm really passionate about, and ever since I was getting into design and into motion design, everyone around me and everyone on the internet was quite skeptical of free tools and open source tools, and everyone's like, no, you can't use Linux, it doesn't support Adobe, how can you work with Adobe, it's not professional, everything that is free can't be professional. Guess what? This whole video is made on Linux and free and open source tools exclusively. Music was done for it, animation, everything was done in Blender, just great free and open source tool, and vector graphics, everything. So is every other video on this channel and all of my client work, and I'm actually not even the only one using it, so you shouldn't be skeptical of free software for creative purposes and obviously for every casual use. It is great and it's not restricting, it feels great to actually be able to choose any sort of hardware I like, to use any computer I would like, unlike those Apple users. And it doesn't make me a better person or you a worse person for using proprietary software. It just kind of happened historically like that with copyright and all. Yeah, like, subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one, obviously. And as always, be memorable.